I'm Jenny Hodgson. I'm Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And we're delighted to have Deborah Doane join us today for this conversation around her book, which may come up in mirror version for you, the INGO Problem, which I've been reading avidly for the last few days. In fact, Deborah reminded me that the first conversation she and I had was on a long bus journey to a conference somewhere, which, trying to put the world to rights. This was back before COVID. So it's a conversation that I think many of us have been holding for a long time. And I'm sure many of you know Deborah through her association with RINGO, the Reimagining the INGO project as well. So it's great to be having this conversation with her today. So we thought that this is how it's going to go. We're going to do a little demographic poll to see who's on the call and how people are feeling. Please feel free to use the chat abundantly if there's stuff you want to add in and contribute to, because I think we can all accept that this is an ongoing conversation, and it is at the level often of nuance and purpose that the details kind of come through. So do sort of please add your thoughts in as the conversation evolves. Deborah's going to talk a little bit about the book and the sort of findings for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. And then later on in the day, we'll be running the meeting again for the other side of the world. And we'll write up some version of it to share as a result of this. So that's the plan for today. I can see more people have joined. Welcome, welcome. Wendy, would you mind launching the poll? And if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat in the meantime, please feel free to do that. I can see Ring has done that from South Sudan. But Wendy, do you want to launch the poll? So there are 3 questions which are fairly self-explanatory. Have you ever worked for an INGO? Have you worked with one as a partner or as a grantee? And what describes your role at the moment? Okay, we'll take a few more seconds for people to respond. Okay, great. We're going to close the poll in 10 seconds. I don't know what 10 seconds looks like, but something that feels like 10 seconds. That's about 3 seconds. Okay, Wendy, do you want to close the poll and we can have a look and see what we look like? So, yeah, 2/3 of this group today have worked for an INGO. That's great. 3/4 have worked with an INGO as a partner grantee. So let's remind ourselves that there's a lot of moving between international and local organizations and other spaces. And today, so the majority is working with a local, national, regional organization. But the other categories, I should have put an other category as well, shouldn't I? Never mind. Okay, so that's us, gang, for today's conversation. We can stop sharing that. So Deborah, can we turn to you and you can set us up with a little bit about the book, the background to the book and some of the key findings in it. Deborah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon to some of you. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a little bit croaky, just so you know. I will do my best. I was also going to ask people to, pop into the chat.
I'm sorry, Deborah. You do it.
Write one thing that makes them, feel free to write one thing that makes them uncomfortable with the INGO system, perhaps, or that could be down to individuals or the wider system. Give us a little bit of fodder. So yeah, I'm going to discuss kind of what I've laid out in the book, the main themes, and I'm going to focus a little bit at the end on what this might mean for the Shift the Power movement in particular. I do various versions of this talk, and I'm really pleased to be here with this group because this is the heart of this book. There's a lot of people in the book who I've interviewed from the Shift the Power movement. And as Jenny said, the book was probably born out of that conversation, that long bus ride that we shared together, Jenny, back in 2017, where we both spent a lot of time moaning about INGOs. And it really set me on a course to setting up the RINGO Project and, you know, finally writing this book. I wanted to find a way to encapsulate all of our frustrations in a short tome. It's a short book. If you haven't read it, I purposefully made it short so it is accessible and readable. For me, the book isn't a death knell for INGOs. I want to put my stall out from the beginning, and I've been challenged on that. So I look forward to our conversation. Do we even need INGOs? I want it to be a rallying cry for change. Of course, the history of INGOs goes back to the 1800s. They've been around for a long time. We've got the Red Cross movement, the YMCA, both came out around the mid 1800s. And the foundations of INGOs were built on people just wanting to help others, right? Their motivations were good. But I would argue that the growth in the sector and the root of the problems starts in post-colonial times when INGOs came into the newly independent colonies, the newly independent countries, to provide services where governments weren't there yet. They weren't able. And arguably, provocatively, situating themselves as new colonizers in place of the old. It was then that they received official standing with the UN, and their importance just basically grew and grew. Now, there have been some really good success stories where INGOs have done good over the years. They haven't been all bad. And I see the successes mainly in the campaigns and advocacy space, but that's my background: trade justice, international debt, tax justice, AIDS. I'm sure there's a few more. But especially as we move into the 1990s, when aid budgets were flourishing, professionalism started to supplant ideas of solidarity. And I almost call this extreme professionalism. So we have log frames, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, you know, McKinsey-esque style management, recruitment of more and more people from the corporate sector into leadership and board positions, importantly. And this was driven by that boom in aid budgets. Some of the biggest INGOs have reached the $1 billion mark by this point and moving forward in terms of turnover. In the book, I go back to my own beginnings in the sector, which was, dare I say it, almost 30 years ago. I'm aging myself now. With something called the Ombudsman Project. And this was set up, it was the first major attempt to bring accountability to INGOs, to make them accountable to the beneficiaries, what they called then the beneficiaries of aid. It came after the Rwanda genocide, where there were acknowledgements about failings of the aid sector. The Ombudsman Project kind of got diluted and turned into something else over the years, but it was a first attempt, and that's when I started working in the sector. But I actually don't think it was, even though there were failings of the sector then, it probably wasn't until the mid-2010s where the rising star of those INGOs really started to fall. And in the book, I point to the Edelman, something called the Edelman Trust Barometer. In 2003, INGOs were the most trusted of all institutions where they were surveyed. So that was Europe, North America. This is in the West. Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, was that okay? You still hear me? By 2023, that figure had fallen significantly below many in the corporate sector. So they were 20 years ago, they were really trusted. 2023, they weren't trusted. And the faulty structure lines really revealed themselves. In 2016, we had the grand bargain. And at the time, less than 1% of funding was reaching local actors. We had closing civic space, the rise of despotic regimes, governments trying to close the civil society's voice, which is still happening and accelerating today. And there were multiple aid scandals: Haiti, the Asian tsunami, sexual exploitation in 2018. COVID, of course, highlighted the problem of white saviorism. And you know, the Shift the Power movement, many in the community philanthropy sector, showed that they don't need these people flying around the globe to deliver aid. We can do it quite well ourselves. Right? Then we had in 2020 again, Black Lives Matter, which really gave voice to people experiencing racism in the sector. Now, what I come to the conclusion of is that the failures in the system aren't down to a few bad actors. They are systemic. They're a failure of the INGO model itself. So what's not working about the current INGO model? And in the book, I look at the usual things that you're all familiar with: accountability, risk, funding, language, to build a picture of the kind of institutional design flaws. I also look at the different sectors. It's not down to just the development sector. It's humanitarian, environment, human rights, peace building. It's across the board. But I think there are three key underlying issues that really come out in the book. The first is the purpose and the role of INGOs. Most INGOs position themselves as the savior of the world's problems, and I'll articulate a bit more about that in a second. The second underlying issue is that INGOs have situated themselves as the prime trusted conduit to accept and filter funding from government. And this is embedded into governance models, not just of an INGO, but the wider system, our systemic governance. And the third that underpins everything is structural racism. So how do these issues manifest themselves in practice? And I try and bring a lot of examples out, but you know, we have website statements saying, we can beat poverty, right? Really grand assertions. We are ending violence against women, you know, that as if that is down to one INGO to do so. You know, it's always, almost always fronted by a white person. I took a picture, I was in Manila 2 weeks ago, and I took a picture of, you know, big INGO advert with Angelina Jolie saying, please give us your money. Sorry, I don't have the slides today. Or Gillian Anderson fronting Comic Relief right now, or not Comic Relief, War Child right now. And these go back years. You'll be familiar with lots of these images. There is still a huge dimension, as I say, of racism and Western supremacy to this. The financial positioning means there is a reliance on INGOs by donors and multilateral agencies. So national and local CSOs are perceived to be riskier, not to be trusted. And INGOs have actually capitalized on this. They've said, don't worry, we're the trusted actor here. And they've used their culture and their privilege to ensure that their experience and knowledge is centered in the minds of donors, of decision makers. And the consequence of this is, even if we're trying to shift power and resources, we can't. So it ends up being a bit of a catch-22 for smaller local actors. They can't take on large grants because they're not big enough. They can't grow to be big enough, so they can't be trusted, right? It's a bit circular. And INGOs, of course, aren't investing in their capacity. They're only investing in their own growth. And I'm going to give some examples of that. HIVOS recently put out their advert to hire fundraisers in Africa and Latin America against all of our calls to say, no, don't do that. In another example, of course, on Ukraine, INGOs with no relationship to the region fronted the international fundraising effort, and they were tasked with the expenditure by donors, including the UN, to decide on what is needed. In the UK alone, the Disasters Emergency Committee, which is an amalgam of aid agencies, raised £450 million, and very little of this, scant little of this, has actually reached local actors. So what follows from all of this is an organizational design and a system that we're all trying to operate in that prioritizes risk management to protect donors, in that Ukraine example, when they were trying to set up a local pooled fund through a community foundation in Ukraine, all of the laws and regulations that a UK organization must adhere to, they have tried to pass on to not just the intermediary Community Philanthropy Association, who was going to manage the pooled fund, but the local actors as well. It wasn't proportionate, nor was it reasonable. We have formal and informal governance models that reflects this white saviorism. So again, legal accountability is to donors, it's to charity regulators, our national charity regulators in the West, and it's based on this mistrust of local actors. Safeguarding, think of all the different policies at the local level that have to be implemented. It's all about protecting those in minority world countries. We have knowledge centers where from Western academics or think tanks that forms the basis of policy. Think the Overseas Development Institute, the Center for Global Development, all of the funding goes to these centers. I did a quick tracing of Gates funding, and more funding for Africa on Gates stays in Washington in think tanks and other spaces than actually makes it to the field. That may not be a bad thing, but that's another conversation. Our knowledge and our language, of course, is predominantly in English. Here we are today speaking in English. In one of the RINGO prototypes, Rasha Sansur said, I would never write a funding application in Arabic, even if a donor allowed me to do so, because it doesn't use the words that they need to hear, right? It's all about the donors rather than about what local communities want and need. And on that, this is a thing that I've really learned from the Shift the Power movement. We talk about the needs of communities, not about the assets that we want to strengthen and build on. The system pays people of color less than white people. Pay differentials. Save the Children found that they did a review of their own pay structures, and they found that people of color earned 2% less than white staff. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you break that down by gender, they found that Black women were paid 23% less than white men and 12% less than white women. We have a system whose success is still measured in terms of funds raised over outcomes. And this is exemplified by the localization strategies like HEVOS that are more about fundraising, setting up a national office so you can raise funding as a local country office, than shifting power. Where it plays out at the systemic level, it starts with ODA, and we've been working on trying to untie aid. This idea that funding from the bilateral sector needs to go through domestic INGOs, and they're best place to protect the aid budgets. And a lot of INGOs defend that stance in different countries quite substantially. I did one interview from a donor who said to me, we don't care if $1 million is wasted by an INGO. We care if $1 is wasted by a local organization because of how it's perceived in terms of waste and trust. Or another donor told me, our systems are designed because we don't trust people of color. It's embedded in our laws and our regulations. So we have anti-terrorism laws, we have auditing rules, we have systemic regulations that get in the way of the ability to shift power. And this is really what the whole of the INGO problem is about. The dominance of INGOs perpetuates the dominance of INGOs. It's a winner-takes-all system, a bit like corporate capitalism, dare I say it. And the consequence of this is a less rich, less diverse civil society at the local level, where people are living this hand-to-mouth existence, and the leaders are taken less seriously. There was a little conversation on our WhatsApp group quite recently where someone said, when I took over, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the person. If you're here, I apologize, speak up in the chat. Who said, when I moved from a country director of an INGO to running a national CSO that I set up, I couldn't get doors opened and people wouldn't take me as seriously. And, you know, this lack of this makes them unable to connect to their local communities and to solve issues. So, which brings us back to my starting point is I still think we need an international sector, but what is it we actually need from them rather than what we have? And I think the starting point has to be focused on demand. There is some demand from local actors about things that they want and need from INGOs. We have the WACC report on Voices from the South that articulated things. We have the wonderful Shift the Power manifesto. There have been a number of open letters, and none of them say necessarily go away completely. I think there are three things that they really say that they want. First is equality and equity. That sounds fairly simple, doesn't it? They want to be supported, not competed with. Local actors don't want to be relegated to the role of mere implementing partners. Some want INGOs to play a facilitating role, helping with information, convening, not gatekeeping. And I did some really interesting case studies on civic space for the International Civil Society Center a few years ago, and the ones that worked well did play that convening role where shrinking space was happening. And finally, they want INGOs to invest we want INGOs to invest in our future, right? INGOs to invest in building the growth of local CSOs. They do still have the capacity to raise funds, and this shouldn't disappear, but it shouldn't be for inflating INGO staff numbers and flying around the world to deliver programs. So International Rescue Committee and Save the Children both announced big redundancies recently. And from what I understand, part of it, they had massive growth as a result of the influx from Ukraine funds. So they inflated their own staff numbers, they built their own organizations to spend that money. What if they had been investing that in local actors instead and doing that completely differently? There are lots of other models that they could have been using. Two principles that come under this. One is the principle of subsidiarity, a terrible technical economics phrase, forgive me. We need to center the idea that as local as possible and as international as necessary. And I think this is, where populism has been able to give hold. We fail to focus on the way that they really connect with issues. And it's very much at the local level. It's not in a UN agreement at the international level, however important those might be, but it's genuinely at the local level. And the second principle is solidarity. And this is a bounty, we use this phrase so often. But what does that mean in practice? Well, it could mean working as a buffer where civic space is closing. It could mean raising political issues when they're required, not hiding behind the safety of charity or neutrality. Let's think about Gaza. Again, going back to the Disasters Emergency Committee in the UK, they issued a big appeal to the UK public, and it looked like people in Gaza and Lebanon were just suffering from an earthquake, that there was no perpetrator of violence against them. It was neutral in order to raise funds for these suffering masses. I mean, it's really quite shocking that that still exists. But it also has to be done in solidarity, in collaboration with local actors. Sometimes they want INGOs to step in, sometimes they want them to step out, and that has to be listened to. Now, what does this mean in practice? I think we need to change the purpose and role of INGOs. And I posit that the purpose of INGOs should be to ensure that civil society everywhere is strong. And the hypothesis being that if we have stronger local, regional, and international civil societies, we'll be more likely to fight for and achieve our aims collectively. And I offer this mission statement. If anyone wants to take it, it's yours. Our purpose is to help create the connections and investment to enable civil society groups, wherever they may be, to work together and inspire people to build a just and good society. I think we need to look at the structure, governance, and size of INGOs. INGOs need to shrink. I'm just going to put that right up front. We need to not pass risk down to the bottom, as we've done with that Save the Children example. People on the ground are facing far more risk. Conducive Space for Peace did an amazing study on a chain of influence, and they mapped something like 30 or 40 steps along the way when you go through donor to INGO all the way down to the ground, of each layer adding its own level of accountability and risk. I think we need to finally address accountability to local people. We tried that with the Ombudsman Project, got watered down. But I think the time is now, and I'm pleased to see Kate is on the line. The Pledge for Change is pioneering some work in this area. Talk to Loop is doing this. Barbara Nost, who many of you will know, and a number of others are leading RINGO prototype in this area, looking at a different way of doing things. We had the RINGO risk prototype that also tried to address proportionate risk and negotiate it with all of the donors. I mentioned shrinking organizations. I think INGOs have to absolutely step out of direct service delivery. I think that's just a fundamental starting point. They could be providing different set of skills. Probably don't need a gender expert in Oxford anymore, really. You know, but we might need other skills and things. And this reverse call proposals that Barbara has been leading has worked with local actors and said, this is what we want and need, and put a call for proposals to international actors to say, please bring us these skills, this support. And they're probably different than what many already have on staff. On this reducing country office presence, I think INGOs have to reduce that country office presence. What we've seen is that where INGOs have sought to localize as their way to address criticism has just been a fundraising exercise. It's led to poaching local funding streams. So if you're on Action Aid Uganda, you can get USAID funding. It didn't expand the pool of funding, it took over the pool of funding. How do we grow local actors rather than supplanting them? We've already heard about fears from local actors in Palestine that they're going to be flooded with aid and new INGO offices post-conflict, and let's all hope for a post-conflict. What can we do to preempt this now? And finally, I promised, we need for INGOs to address their primary intermediary role. An intermediary is a contentious phrase. The reality is that the large donors cannot manage thousands and thousands and thousands of grants. So who do they give that to, and how is that managed? I think INGOs should let go of being that primary intermediary of funds for donors. They could potentially invest in building stronger networks of local intermediaries rooted in communities and issues. But even with shrinking aid budgets, INGOs will continue to raise significant amounts of funds from the public. That's evidenced from Gaza, it's evidenced from Ukraine and so on. And where they do play that intermediary role, they have to offer direct funding, shared core costs, and investment in local capacity with the long-term view of stepping aside. So what does this mean for us, the Shift the Power movement? I think we could be focusing a lot more on demanding change and agreeing the terms on which we might work, on which you might work. Local actors are very conditioned to accept the terms of engagement. And going back to this reverse call for proposals, when we've been working, when the Zambian Governance Foundation has been working with the local community, they said, and they finally had some responses from a couple of INGOs, and they said, you mean we can lead and we don't have to listen to them, they can listen to us? And we reiterated, yes, you are in charge, you are in control of that relationship, and they have to be doing what meets your needs, not the other way around. I think we can highlight and use new success measures. I think one of the key ones for me is the strength and inherent value of civil society, right? How do we show that makes things better? How do we demonstrate our own influence? I think we can improve our own efforts to think systemically and influence systemically. How can we collaborate to change some of these rules that I've mentioned, like untying aid or risk management? It's worth thinking about what we do want and need from international actors and sending those signals much more strongly when we do need to collaborate and when don't we? And what we're already doing, building new power centers, reducing our reliance on international actors, especially for funding. And this probably includes investing in new knowledge centers based in global majority countries. I think our biggest challenge is that these issues are systemic. They're not down to one individual organization, as this is where RINGO came in to a degree. But it's worth noting that the issues are also deeply personal, right? It's very difficult to tell someone who's come to work in the sector, especially a young person, go away. We don't need you. You're not doing good. You're causing harm, right? And then for those more senior in the sector, there is a fear of losing importance, of losing power, of losing access to government, of losing influence, fear of being held accountable, fear of laying off staff and dealing with HR challenges, because that will happen, that does happen. Fear of seeing these drops in age budgets and wanting to batten down the hatches and protect everything. You know, Australia is now at 0.2% in terms of its aid budget, you know, in spite of the long-standing target to be 0.7. So to close, I think the role of international actors isn't to perpetuate the kind of post-war stepping in of states and to hold their dominant position in civil society. Local people have the ability to do what needs to be done. I think the role is to support, to help create the conditions whereby local people can bring about change. And that's here in the UK as much as it is in Zambia, right? And we need to use the international influence and connections to help fight some of these systemic challenges. And our challenge, I suppose, as a Shift the Power movement, is to think collectively ourselves and almost to teach the international sector how it's done, right? This is a great opportunity to build our collective civil society future. And at some point, INGOs will have to step up, I think, in order to step out. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Deborah. And I really appreciate the fact that you're a bit under the weather, but nonetheless, that was very, very good, clear. I think everyone appreciated it. Just, you know, reflecting on your book and your comments just now, and I think for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with the origins of the Shift the Power movement, it came out of a field that wasn't really looking to transform big systems, but actually the slow work of a set of individuals and organizations who are looking through the lens of community philanthropy, solidarity-based organizing of resources, looking to find ways to involve local people as owners of their own development. And back in the early days of the Global Fund for Community Foundations, one thing that really struck me was quite how many people were starting to set up new kinds of institutions that valued local resources and local assets, and started with community and the idea of participation of community, almost with a sense, I mean, some explicitly with a sense that working within the dominant international development system wasn't going to change anything. So looking at local resource mobilization, not just from the perspective of money, but from the perspective of collective buy-in and action, as organizing collective power, of helping communities to realize that if they worked together, they could make claims of others, they could be in charge of their development. And so I think over the last, you know, decade or so, this idea that as this dominant system of aid has been sort of starting to creak and show its weaknesses, there have been emergent alternatives bubbling up around the world. We work with a network of around 300 partners in 80 countries who are, none of them really seeking to replicate becoming local versions of international NGOs. They are really looking to bring people into places so that people can start to activate their voice and power, and to define community as something that is inclusive and growing, rather than what we know right now as to be sort of shrinking and diminishing. And we see in our work, however, that it's impossible to do this when there are forces out there that push against that. So when some of our partners will encourage community members to come to sort of event or workshop, and they're going, but we normally get paid, we normally get a per diem, because if we went to a workshop yesterday, we got money for this. So like there are deep behaviors that get in the way on the ground about putting people in charge of their own work. We see it in Ukraine. We work with a network of around, we've supported about 15, 16 community foundations there that are still invisible to the dominant system. Deborah mentioned the £450 million raised that went predominantly to international NGOs. We're working with organizations that are still raising money locally within Ukraine during the time of war, because they believe it is essential that people own and can help steer local organizations. So this idea that there are other things bubbling up, but we're also in a system which encourages local actors to look like mini versions of NGOs in order to tick all the boxes. You know, we understand that we are working in systems that don't really speak to each other. The number of times our partners have fantastic staff doing great community-based work, and then we get a message saying, oh, they got a job at the UN at an international NGO because the salaries are higher. So this sort of constant hollowing out of local organizations we see time and time again. And the idea that actually the system we're in is built on distrust at the moment rather than trust. So when you have a local actor that's getting regular contributions from community members, somehow we're not able to see that in the dominant system as an indicator of trust and local buy-in. We want things that look like our acceptable audits and compliance and risk determinants. So there's also something to do with a lack of imagination here too. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. And I'll while you're thinking about what it is, or comments, or because we've got to make this solution together, right? To come back to you, Deborah, I mean, you mentioned the word solidarity, and I think it is one of the words that people have really felt quite conflicted around, that there's a narrative, a rhetoric that this is global solidarity, and INGOs have put themselves as the sort of apex organizations who build solidarity. And yet, when you're a local organization and you hear that that same organization has registered a local office, is now competing with you for money in your country, that doesn't feel like solidarity. We are in a moment in the world where clearly things are not going in the direction of progressive social change. Other forces are using all manner of tools to mobilize against kind of progressive ideals. So it seems like we really need to be moving beyond sort of slight tinkering and reform towards this idea of what solidarity looks like. And you talked about connections and investments and, you know, centering it around accountability to local people. Deborah, do you think there's an extent to which one should just stop bothering to try and change organizations that are going through the motions of shifting power? And should we just be kind of starting to move as those a coalition of the willing to say, actually just move into a different space. Let's start from something different and organize from there. Or, I mean, are we wasting our time hoping for small gains where organizations are tinkering a little to tick some boxes? What's your personal sense of where you would be putting your energies in all this right now?
Oh, that's such a difficult one. That's a really tough question, Jenny, actually.
Sorry, this is all our question, so anyone else
I
can
think
chip in too.
I would say, I think because we need to, if INGOs are getting in the way of us building a better future, then there has to be some people, not everyone, spending some effort working with at least the front runners of that system, right? There will always be the big actors who are going to go for growth, who have corporate fundraisers on their board and celebrities and all the rest of it. We're not going to get rid of them, but we can certainly create a system with some other front runners that's much more responsive to our needs. And I think, you know, I use the example of Gaza. We did a webinar with the Dahlia Fund, which is a member, on what is it what don't they want from INGOs and what do they want from INGOs. And they said, you know, we've worked for 20, 30, 40 years with INGOs doing service delivery locally. Where has that gotten us, right? What we need from INGOs is political solidarity right now, right? Stopping arms trade, helping to stop the war, calling out the war crimes, right? They don't need them to step in and do that service delivery. So I think what we need to do is set up the processes and the systems so that we are in the space collectively agreeing together what our respective roles are in this very tumultuous time that we're working in. So I you know, in the last chapter, I say process is everything. We kind of know what's wrong with the system. I've just synopsized the whole book. You've done a pretty good job too, Jenny. But What we don't have are those systemic processes in place where we can build collaborative solutions to say, actually, Oxfam International, this is what I need from you right now. Get out, go away, don't do that, but do that. So I think we can collectively build those spaces and not wait for the INGOs to do that, but invite them in where we think they might be useful to do so. Yeah, solidarity is a difficult one, and it can be very tokenistic, but it can also be deep. And I think that deepness is really built into processes and investing upfront in those processes. It's very difficult to do those processes in the midst of a crisis. Going back to the Middle East example, someone from Lebanon was calling out after Israel had bombarded Lebanon, all of the INGOs were once again going in and doing needs assessments. And she said, where were they before? You know, we knew this was all happening. Why didn't they have warehouses of supplies already stockpiled, right? Why weren't they working with us? We're working tirelessly at the local level on the ground. Why didn't we have those systems in place where that was already up front and there? So I think, yes, spending time with those who do want to change, but we also collectively have to look at what are the levers for change, because as I said, these issues are systemic. They're hardwired into the donor system. They're not necessarily down to an individual INGO to change.
Thanks, Deborah. And we know that if you're just, working in an international NGO and you've got your board and your management structures, we know that often board's role is to see the organization they govern to grow, is not to be part of being the front runners of enabling a new system in which they might be smaller. So some of these barriers are real about who has power and what success looks like in different ways. But I love that idea of the kind of bringing together the front runners almost in quiet spaces to have these conversations. So not announcing to the world, we're meeting next week and we'll have solved it, but actually starting to build that sort of trust and relational connections between people working in different parts of the system. Great. Anders, I can see you've got your hand up. So this is a time for you all to chip in and help think some of this stuff through. So Anders, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Thank you very much. My name is Anders. I work with a Danish organization called SISU. I think I was just sparked by your comments on solidarity, and just wanted to add a few thoughts on that, because the way we sort of operate is that there's a large subcategory of volunteer-based, half-time professional Danish organizations who work in partnerships, and I think it's important not to underestimate the value of that enormous amount of people that are organized and get and rally behind Danish organizations or Czech or Spanish organizations where they actually do a lot of thoughtful processes to consider what solidarity means. I mean, what kind of partnerships they can materialize based on their thoughts on solidarity. So it's not to say that they can also rally behind INGOs, but there's a lot of organizations that have a more popular base, if you can say so, that can sort of bolster strong elements of solidarity and lead not only fundraising campaigns, but lead a lot more deep solidarity, as you said, Deborah, in terms of how can you gather around, how can we now gather support and make more value out of these partnerships with the community groups everywhere. So I think that's just, from our perspective, it's really important that we can support this larger popular base of people who rally behind different causes around the world, and that they are present in their minds, and that they're present in their conversations with other people around their neighbors and everywhere.
Thanks for that really important point. I think the idea that there are lots of good people caught in bad structures. There are a lot of good people who want to be part of something bigger, but maybe intermediation gets in the way currently. So how do we actually find ways to harness that solidarity that we believe to be out there, and what does that look like? And maybe that is about organizing differently. Thank you very much for that. Julia, I can see you got your hand up and you're outside. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Sorry, I'm calling from the street. I have a medical appointment, so I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you fine.
I'm working. I'm working with a consulting company, Aropa, and we are supporting INGOs to develop systems and structures that center equity, and we help them to operationalize their in the sector of work displacement. We call it meaningful participation, to their meaningful participation commitments. And I was wondering, hearing you talking about how the collective civil society should organize to push for change. When I see, for example, that we have calls for proposals from INGOs that only give like 10K to 30K to do an equity audit, and you can feel that sometimes it's not meaningful enough, or that when you like we're always afraid that your recommendations are going to finish on the bookshelf, and you can have the best guidance and the best policies. If you don't push INGOs, like if INGOs are not dropping their strength to enforce themselves and start saying, okay, I think we need to change, and start asking how and seeking support for how to change. I don't know how, like, if you're gonna implement at the end of the day localization or meaningful participation from communities. So what would you suggest in terms of how do we operate as the allied civil society to push these big mastodons to say that they have to change and start acting? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Deborah, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want to take a few more comments and then you can gather them up? Yeah, okay. Let's invite a few more comments, because I think these points are all sort of related. Ben, you've got your hand up. Feel free to switch your camera on if you want as well.
Sure. Hopefully, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. No, I just want to say thanks very much for the presentation. It was really, really helpful. So I work for Cooperazione Internazionale, and I've worked for a number of INGOs in the past, and also I'm on the board of a local NGO in Congo. So it's nice to be able to have those different dynamics. And one of the discussions we're having at the moment is actually we're registered as an international, but should we actually register as a national organization for accessing funds, different aspects? Anyway, the point I just wanted to make, or at least kind of reiterate what you're saying, is around the pragmatic point of donors being the key part to this in terms of the funding structures. Working with COPI, so I'm humanitarian partnerships manager, and I focus on kind of working with ECHO and USAID funding, so the kind of humanitarian response. And the biggest changes I've seen for COPI, and probably for other organizations, is when the donors have said, all right, we need you to do X, Y, Z in terms of the environment or working with local partners. And I think, unfortunately, there is a pragmatism of when the donors move, NGOs move. So I think there's a lot of focus we need to put on pushing donors to shift their space. And that's also in terms of legal rules, in terms of the EU, because currently there's only a certain amount that can go to local organizations, and not usually directly. So yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that I think pushing donors is a critical aspect, and us as people within INGOs, we can push. And so there's a few of us pushing within COPI to look at a longer term vision, but as well, that then it's a difficult dynamic internally. So yeah, focusing on the donors is critical. But thanks so much. I totally agree with what's been said. So thanks. Thanks
so much, Ben. I think this is such an interesting one as well, and Deborah may have her thoughts on this, but let me just jump in. So my experience from where I sit at the vantage point of trying to promote community philanthropy as part of a strategy to shift power, as one part of it, as a way of building power from the bottom up, is that donors have been curious. There's been experiments. FCDO has a program called Shifting the Power, which is a partnership with Comic Relief in 3 countries in Africa. USAID has Local Works, which really promotes demonstrating the power of local resources. The Dutch government has invested quite a lot through the Power of Voices program in building more kind of bottom-up approaches. So I think it's also about how do we do the collective mapping and weaving of where the levers are and where the obstacles are, because sometimes people say, oh, it's not us, it's our donors, and then you have donors going, no, we'd like to do something different, but how do we do it? So maybe the point is actually, how do you find all the different levers and just like zone everything out along the way, right, to get to this point. I understand Hugh has got a physical hand up, which I can now see. Hugh, over to you. Thank you. You need to unmute, Hugh. Hang on, Hugh. We'll just unmute you. Wendy, could you? Hang on, there we go. Good. Yes, we can hear you now. Oh, no, we can't.
Hugh, you're on mute.
You're still on mute. So you should get a message saying, I've asked you to unmute, so you should click something on your screen and then you'll be unmuted.
Unmute, right? Hang on.
Yes,
Unmute.
you're unmuted now.
I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Yeah, I entirely agree with Ben's point. I'm both a funder and I've also been heavily involved in co-founding a local organization. And I helped fund it, but I had to scratch around for funds as well. And I've stepped out now and they're running it on their own and it's working very, very well. I enjoyed the book and I really congratulate you, Deborah, on this book. It's terrific. I've learned a lot from it, great benefit, and I've enjoyed this seminar. Couple of points I'd just like to make. It might be valuable to work out the reasons why people use NGOs. We still use local NGOs. We still use NGOs, Oxfam, ActionAid, and Plan International and people. And the reasons for doing it, I think, are common culture and language between funder and NGO. We live in the same country, speak the same language, similar education, ease of accessibility. You can go along and see them in Oxford or London or something, rather than going to India, although we've done a lot of field work. Easier time with the regulator. We find it very, very difficult to give money directly abroad. So we prefer to give it through INGOs, because the regulators, I tell you, the amount of my time as a funder I spend messing around with regulators. We bank with 4 banks, and they give us a hell of a hard time. And vast amount of my time is diverted from what I should be doing to talking to the regulator. And also, I think confidence in the INGOs system of anti-corruption budgeting systems and equal opportunity, respectable gender things, and all of those things. So I think it's worthwhile looking at the reasons why people like me are still prepared with an open mind and trying to use an equal voice to use international funders, and to see which ones are the areas where you can most easily influence. And I totally agree with Ben that a lot of the problem for INGOs is that they get briefs from the government, which are incredibly restricted. And they have to do things they don't want to do particularly, because the government's politicians, short-term people keener on satisfying voters in their own country than people in the so on. So just sorry about the rant, but I really enjoyed this session. Thank you so much.
Should I come in on
Yes,
these?
why don't you come in,
do a
Deborah?
second round, because they're actually all linked, right? The question of how do we really get the big INGOs to shift when the incentives are hardwired into the system for them not to shift, right? The donors imposing their rules, and the USAID funding. Yes, there is that wonderful local works program at USAID. We don't know what's going to happen under Trump. I can only begin to imagine. But even with those strong aspirations under a democratic government, they still only reach 10%, even though they've pledged to reach 25% and later 30% and more. So the donors are really at the heart of a lot of this. But I think what we ignore is collective influence. I gave a presentation to Concord, which is the network of European INGOs, recently, back in September, to think about actually, what is it the networks can do to help build that collective influence on the system? And start to, it's an oldie styley campaign, really. Start to articulate what are those issues that are getting in the way. There's been a lot of great work done. So Hugh, you're experiencing problems transferring funds. I'm also chair of a board where we have similar problems and banking restrictions. And that comes down to Financial Action Task Force, which is this nerdy international anti-terrorism financing regime that is completely disproportionate to reality. And there's been a lot of work done to try and influence and change those rules to say, how do we ensure that local actors can be trusted? And interestingly, in a RINGO prototype, we did an experiment on risk in the Philippines with USAID and an intermediary, Global Giving, and others, the Center for Disaster Preparedness, and we reduced something like 55 requirements that USAID required, which is to get funding to the local level, to 1. And that was the anti-terrorism one, but they just had to be on a certain register, and that was it. Right. And that was through negotiating to say what is reasonable, what is proportionate. So we can mainstream that negotiated process, but we can also try, if we use our collective influence, and this is where INGOs come in, right? Pledge for Change could be doing this. I see Kate's just popped something in, right? Minimizing that burden on partners. We can be identifying those rules and regulations that are getting in the way of local funding. And that's from philanthropy, equally from bilateral donor funding. So I agree a lot needs to be done, but when INGO leaders, and this is boards, tell me, but the donors asked for this, we follow the money, we can't do anything else. Actually, you can. You do have collective power and influence to change that.
Thank you very much.
Deborah, do you want to respond to Julia's question as well?
Well, Julia's comment is, how do we get the big ones? How do we push the big ones to change? And I guess this is where I think for those working with INGOs, I think there needs to be probably some collective risk taking to say we're going to push back and not accept funds on certain terms. And I've seen some people doing that. And eventually, I think thinking about going back to collective action, collectively demanding we will work on this basis, we won't work on this basis. If INGOs don't have partners to work through, they're not going to be able to function. So think of ourselves almost as the client, right? What is it we want and need from them? What don't we want and need from them? And if you're working in the system, Julie, well, you're a consultant, so you're kind of been slightly outside the system. It's building the spaces where that demand can be heard, I think, and building that into programming processes and partnership processes and so on. And for, as I said, for those in those partnerships at the local level, naming your terms and conditions a bit more effectively. And I'll give a really clear example of this. In the RINGO project, I originally ran the funding through a think tank based in New York. Funding went very smoothly, no conditions attached for almost all of our donors, very few conditions attached. The project itself transferred to be managed by the West African Civil Society Institute. And suddenly the demands and the requirements were much greater. And we worked with WEXI to say, push back. No, you don't need detailed budgets. I wasn't asked for them. Why should you be asked for them for the same project? And we managed to get it to that point, but they were conditioned to accepting it in that way, right? That's the way we work. We have detailed financial reports. We put everything in a tight little budget line. It's not core funding. And we were able to push back and say, if you managed it with one entity that way, you have to do it with the other. And it worked. But that courage to stand up to your values, I think, is challenging.
Thanks, Deborah. Just to circle the loop on the program you mentioned in the Philippines, Assets Agency and Trust, where you managed that it was possible to negotiate down with USAID from 52 requirements to 1. I just wanted to acknowledge that Linda Gobrin is on the call, who's one of the organizations that participated in that program. And if we're talking about that being a sort of supply side chain, I don't want to put Linda on the spot, but also the demand side of the equation was that Linda also learned from other partners in the kind of shift the power space and is now looking at a kind of solidarity-based community philanthropy contribution to build the connective tissue within the movements that she's part of. So it's a really nice story. Shout out to Linda who's joined the call, which this was an example of one thing unlocking something within the dominant system and another thing unlocking practice with an emergent system. And I think, you know, you're also talking about the owning our own power piece as being so important, that no one is going to negotiate with those with power on their own. But when you start to create spaces for collective action and people realizing that they are all subject to a system in which they can't thrive, so reducing that from personal burnout to realizing that it's a systemic failure, I think is also extremely liberating in one starting to think about alternatives. Rosemary, been a while, nice to see you. What is it you'd like to say? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Rosemary and Jenny, really lovely to see you again and to be part of this. So I'm based in Nairobi. Well, I'm in Nairobi, Kenya, and I've been in this space of philanthropy, whether it's corporate or local resources, working with organizations. But I think for this purpose is really trying to work with local organizations and to create the local foundations and really empower local actors to take action for what's happening on the ground. And I've been fortunate to have worked with a worked in a campaign that was well known called Kenyans for Kenya, which really boosted our as Kenyans as our ability to be able to address some of our challenges. But also more recently worked with Aga Khan Foundation and a project called Yetu. Very eye-opening, amazing experience. So this conversation is it's fantastic. I am telling myself I need to definitely share this with a lot more organizations. One of the things that came out very clearly is that you mean this can be actually discussed in a webinar, because as a local partner, it's really, many people appreciate and recognize that, yes, INGOs have their role, but also I think there's a need to rethink the conversations and and how we work with other partners in INGOs, especially because what my experience has been, the INGOs tend to sometimes cannibalize what local organizations are trying to achieve. And then also because the funding or the partnership is always about the funds, never any other assets, whether it is time or any other ways that we work. But I just wanted to add one or two things about today, really. It was, we are, I'm not sure whether you guys know, but we are going through a very interesting session with young people, the Gen Zs going out and really pushing forward the issues about governance. And what it is telling us is also really change will happen, whether we are ready or not, right? So much has happened and young people have found a way, taken courage and taken the mental on how the political discourse can change. We as a older generation are watching and seeing it's true. You know, even if we were not ready, if we were thinking of different ways of how to address issues of governance or leadership or political leadership in this country, we would have never expected to see what has happened. So from where I sit and we're thinking about how can INGOs change and how can we have different kind of relationship, the best example with about 80% of our population in Africa being young people, they will change it. I think it would be good for, it would be worth organizations really thinking about what side of history do you want to be part of. So because it, you know, and there's a much more awakening, there's a much more woke, as they call themselves, the Gen Z, to start really using their voices, using their other resources to demand for change. So I sit in a couple of NGOs, local NGOs, and that's one of the key things, to try and get them to shift and start building capacities and engagement with the local actors. But I think a lot of people hearing that this is possible, that they can actually share and say, this is the kind of relationship we'd like with international NGOs, I think will be really, really good. So what I just really want to say, I'm so glad I'm part of this, to hear this 2024. But really good, because I think I was part of the start when we started the Shift the Power. And so it's so good to see the influence it has done. But change is going to happen. I was suggesting that one of the ways to get international organizations to change is one of the ways to measure your successes is to include some of those factors. What are you doing to shift and change some of the ways you operate with your other partners? So let me stop there. But thanks you. This has been one of my best, to be honest, webinars.
Oh, you can definitely come again, Rosemary. But Rosemary, thank you for raising that, because I think, you know, the larger point from what I'm hearing is actually it's not, you know, change is going to come whether we like it or not. I think Kenya is a really good example, the whole Gen Z thing around how, you know, not dissimilar to some years back when Donald Trump banned people coming from Muslim countries, or, you know, various sort of assaults on human rights in the US, which led to huge outpourings of giving, right? Giving was not just fundraising. It was an expression of dissent, of solidarity, of mobilization. And that's what happened in Kenya. Now, that there has been a dance with the Kenyan government using the Ford Foundation of being behind the demonstration. But actually the evidence showed it was young people giving through multiple different kinds of platforms, solidarity based. And that really comes where the rubber hits the road. This is not about moving money. This is about creating the conditions in which democratic participation can happen and people can hold others to account. And I think generally, Kenya is a really interesting example of a critical mass. There have been long-term investments in Kenya over a number of years to see that a different option of how development is done is possible by starting with Kenyans, their resources, their aspirations, and developing architecture and infrastructure that is in service of that, which is quite a different kind of story. So we have the examples. We're talking about the coalition of the willing, the examples, the models. So thank you for bringing Kenya back onto the space, because it has been a sort of a 20-year journey essentially of those deep roots that were set, which are now starting to kind of come to light. We have a colleague from South Sudan, Ring, as what I can see. Would you like to speak and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Jenny. My name is Ring, as I said, from South Sudan, working for Child Destiny Development Organization, a national NGO. I just want to inquire whether the soft copy could be also available so that also we read that book. Because from the discussions, actually, I'm hearing a lot of good words and I want to know what is there. That's one. And then the discussion on shifting the power, to me, actually, is a very good advocacy agenda point, although it takes time, you know, for change to come, because everything now is all about survival and strategy. If you don't strategize very well, you will not survive. So shifting the power is all about, you know, giving resources, because resources actually are the source of power. So let the engagement continue. I know it's not an easy thing because, you know, giving or relinquishing some powers, you know, to a local actor who is going also to grow up and will be also a very stiff competitor to an INGO is not an easy thing. To me, I like the discussion and I need actually to read that book if possible. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ring. We're going to give details about the book. Deborah can tell us about its availability. But what I do want to say is you're quite right. Actually, this shift the power, energy and movement has not reached everywhere yet. But we had a colleague from South Sudan join a meeting in Mozambique with other colleagues from Africa a couple of months ago from Amalna, Our Hope, South Sudan. So Ring, if you wanted to check with Joseph Luarte there, he's actually
Joseph Luarte, actually, we are together here in South Sudan. He's one
of
the new members.
You go. So
he's one of the new members, actually.
Yeah, he's one of your network weavers for now, but let's continue the conversation. Deborah, do you want to say about a bit about the availability of the book and respond to what Rosemary had said? And Wendy's also put some information there.
Yeah, Wendy's put in, so you can get it. I know it's a long way to weave the hard copy to you, Ring. If there is anyone who's going to be in London, I can arrange to get you some copies if you're going to be going back to South Sudan. But you can get an e-copy from the link that Wendy's just put in. If you want an e-copy, you can also order a hard copy. Amazon, for countries that has Amazon, as much as we hate Jeff Bezos, you can get it from Amazon or direct from the publisher. And an e-copy is obviously instant if you have an e-reader. So that's how to get the book. I hope that's okay. That's kind of the best I can do. I may work on an audio book. I've been asked to, and a friend of mine has offered to record it. I'm going to wait till my voice is better to do that, though. Rosemary, I mean, I love what's happened in Kenya, and spent a bit of time discussing this with INGO, of course, Houghton, who's involved in the Shift the Power movement, who said how they shifted that role of INGOs in Kenya significantly. And I think it's a really interesting model. I think we've also seen a similar uprising in Bangladesh, actually.
Yeah.
And so there's, it's interesting that they've put the head of BRAC kind of to help the transition of that country, a locally led INGO. I think the reverse call for proposals, I'm a bit of an evangelist for it, but I am on a mission to mainstream this way of doing things. So the normal way of doing things is the donor issues a call for proposals, INGOs respond, they bring together a whole ton of local actors to be their implementing partners, and then they end up with very little piece of the pie. This whole idea of reversing, bringing together a local community to say, actually, this is what we want and need from international actors, and issuing their own national call for proposals to see how can you help us, I think is incredibly empowering. And I just had a meeting to also do this, I hope, with that group in the Philippines. And if that was the normal way of doing things, then that would absolutely center this model that Jenny talked about, that it starts from, what did I say, as local as possible, as international as necessary. Right? I think it centers that model. So that's what I would say about that. But do bring this conversation to your communities and have the power to do that. That's what I was hoping the book would do. There's a lot of INGOs that are doing book clubs around it. Boards are reading it. It was meant to be a resource to help pull together all of these frustrations that you couldn't always quite articulate in one place. So I hope it helps to do that. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Deborah. I can see people have put very smart things in the chat as well. So if anyone actually wants to turn that into words, I can see there are comments from Inga, from Linda's on a bus, from Gail, and others. So Amanda, anyone want to? Sorry, I'm just racing through.
There was a question from Jacob, which I would almost want someone else to answer it, about
how
local and national organizations have reduced their deliverables once the big donors started funding them. And I'd love to know a bit more about that, what that means in practice. But on that second part of the question, how can local actors maintain momentum to ensure these relationships become long-term value additions? This is where I go back to process, right? If you're working at a terms of engagement with a local actor, I would agree about the terms of engagement. How often are we going to meet? On whose terms, rather than the INGO say, please meet us every 2 weeks with an detailed report. What works for you? What are the conditions that work for you? And I think we have to set out those equitable processes from the start. And if it means turning away funding, that is a risk. I guess you have to decide if that risk is worthwhile. I don't know about how it's reduced deliverables once the big donors have stepped in, except I can only surmise that that means more money is going to administration and less on actual doing. And we really need to push back on that.
Thanks. Jacob, did you want to add to that? I'll leave that option open. Otherwise, if there are other people with questions or comments.
Okay.
Okay, Jacob and then Amanda. Jacob, go for it.
Thank you very much. It has been a great conversation. And for me as a local player, I wanted to also do the listening because of this enriching conversation. Now, the concern for me has always been, like for us in Nigeria here, you get to see, like I stated, local organizations doing excellent work in local communities. But again, once the big donors come, they come with some conditions. You write a lot of emails. You begin to adjust yourself to a condition that ordinarily when you were using your personal funds, you were raising local funding. It wasn't, the requirements were not as administrative as it is now. So that has been a very big concern that to some of us who also even asked, will it even be a good thing for us to, yes, good money, big organizations bring big money, you do big work, but when it takes away the joy that you were doing this work naturally, it has this way of undermining your passion to continue with the work. So these are just the concerns that I just felt like highlighting more strongly beyond just writing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Brilliant. I mean, I think you go to the heart of it, actually. You know, the danger of doing harm to things that started out of good intention and good purpose and trust and a recognition of local resources, and then external money turning you into a bureaucratic blockage in the system, I think is something, you know, this shifting power is not about moving the same bureaucracy from London to Lagos. It is really exactly how are we working in a system which centers that sense of purpose and joy and intent and resolve, not just turning us into bureaucrats. So thank you so much for that very powerful point. It is very well taken and kind of really goes to the heart of what I think we should all be about. Amanda, I saw, Deborah, you go, and then we'll hear from Amanda. Yeah,
as we're on this point, and then we'll come to Amanda. This is that over-professionalization, and this is where INGOs or other intermediaries need to use their power to absorb those bureaucracies and push back on that risk and not pass it down the chain, right? So you can push back to the donor if you're an INGO or another form of intermediary. I often use the term of a bouncer. Think of your role as a bouncer, right? You know, if you go into I don't know if that is a universal phrase, but if you're going into a bar here, you know, a bouncer keeps the troublemakers out, right? When I was working for an INGO, I saw my role as the bouncer to keep headquarters well, I was in headquarters, but to keep my managers at bay, to let my team get on with the fun stuff, right? The passion, the good work. And I think intermediaries need to almost think of themselves as a bouncer, that they absorb the pressure, the stress, the issues, the risk to let people get on with the work when they play that role. So I think that's a point to INGOs in particular. Sorry.
But Deborah, doesn't it also just go back to what is the larger normative purpose of the work? Like, we're not out just to move money from A to B, like, and how do we push that back up the system, that there's actually a purpose around people living their lives in dignity, you know, with justice, all of that kind of thing. And that easily gets lost in the moment of administering bureaucratic systems.
It does. And I guess I'm not naive about this. I've worked in the bureaucratic system as well. Those things won't disappear completely. You know, a lot of the bureaucracy is political, and it takes us time to break that down. So I guess it's, in the meantime, it's pushing back, reminding the donors of the real purpose and the intent, but where they do continue to exist, absorbing that to enable local actors to do the good work that they do and to hold the risk, because, you know, Jacob's holding a lot more risk than someone sitting in London or Washington or New York, right?
Yeah. Amanda, we'll love to hear from you. Hi, and Jenny. Then we'll hear from Kevin. Hi.
Good to meet you. Yeah, Mike, what I was really trying to explore is to what extent, because it's really been interesting in working with our Alliance of Local Organisations, how they have, over time, the emphasis has been not just to focus on what happens locally and nationally, but actually really strongly seeing the necessity to work internationally and nationally, because the two really work together. So at the moment, the conversation seems to be that if it's international, it needs to be an international NGO that actually holds that convening space. And what I'd really like to explore is to what extent could we create genuinely democratic processes whereby communities can elect who represents them to then convene those representatives, not just at a local level, but increasingly at regional and international level, so that accountability is very much bound to back to those communities that elected those representatives. So you use a democratic process for gradually being able to influence at different levels, which is, and for me, that doesn't need to be an INGO, that needs to be local organizations being convened in a democratic way so that they can act not just at a local level, but nationally and internationally.
Just I'll do one by one now, Jenny, if that's all right. So my mind is working, finally kicked in. That's how the food sovereignty movement, for example, works that way. And a lot of social movements work that way. I guess there's a question at some point, you do need formal institutions, partially for shifting funding. There are going to be legal reasons to enable that. And there is a collective brand power, though you can get that collective brand power through. So one of the things I suggested in the book is that we need new organizational models, like a cooperative. I think the cooperative model provides us with a lot of a really good framework that's very different than the charity model of working and much more solidarity based. So it may still be a formal institution, but it's a different governance model. So that's where I've gone.
I totally agree. I think the cooperative movement is the way to go.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's like the idea of how do we exercise radical imagination. In the Shift the Power movement, we talk about new ways of deciding and doing. Like, we don't have to stick with the structures we've got. They were made by people. We can unmake them when we can make other ones. And so I think the moments around kind of global citizens assemblies, cooperative movements, like we should be looking everywhere.
No, and I've looked into governance models as well with a lawyer. I mentioned a few of them in the book, of ways we can completely reimagine the governance of INGOs and those legal structures. So it's acknowledging that you might need a formal institution in some cases, and how best to do that in a much more democratic and cooperative manner.
Yeah, form follows function, not the other way around. Kevin, over to you.
Can you guys hear me? Sounds good. I first would just like to say I love how concrete the conversations have been. I mean, the reverse call for proposals. I love how we're also talking about intermediaries as bouncers. It makes it much more easier than the classic jargon of the sustainable, resilient system that we're going through right now. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. I have so many questions as well, but I'm just gonna get to kind of my role and what I'm doing right now in the process that I'm going through. I was born in the US. I went through a lot of these systems of understanding the UN system, understanding the global humanitarian system, and I kind of could have continued through that. I'm also a Turkish citizen, and so I decided actually I wanted to kind of discover working for a local NGO and how to help them in their processes and in their visibility and credibility in being able to push forward localization. So that's my current role, and doing a lot of research and policy and trying to understand really practically how do we shift this power rather than just talk about it. So that's why I've joined this conversation. I really, really appreciate these conversations. One thing that I've been a little bit similar in inspiration from the reverse call for proposals, because I think it's very simple in its essence, but it's very powerful in its idea. I would love to try to get that as an operation as well with my organization. But another thing I was thinking of is, I really think that what makes me uncomfortable, going back to that first question, what makes me uncomfortable is I still feel like we haven't really concretely defined partnership yet. And I think we just need to start using a different word, because the current way of partnerships are just completely out of proportion resource-wise and decision-making wise. So I've been trying to think of it more as how do we define allyships versus partnerships, because I've been hearing about alliances and allies, and this is obviously something with social justice movements that's really important. How do we be an ally to different social justice movements? So in my mind, I was also thinking, international NGOs have never really figured out the exit strategy this whole time. Never really figured it out in terms of how to effectively leave, I think, and how to effectively potentially express a solidarity exit strategy. How do local NGOs lead an international NGO in localization and in their exit strategy? I think could be a really cool capacity building program. So an allyship mentorship program where a local NGO can help large international NGOs with being able to exit and with being able to shift power and shift decision making. So these are just a couple of thoughts that have come to my mind and that I'm trying to work on right now. And I guess another example, leading into a question for you, Deborah, is I joined the last webinar that was about Help International and Help Age Myanmar. And in this shift, do you think do you know of any examples, or have you heard of any examples of a separate local NGO working to help an international NGO in an exit strategy, or has it been more about solidarity with giving the independence, in a sense, to a local office to become its own NGO? Because that was the case for Help Age or Help International and Age Myanmar. I think that's my question, is more about exit strategies and these things.
Other people might know there's the Stopping a Success website. Someone's put a link in there. The only example I know of is more on the, it was quite fraught, and I used the case study in the book, is where International Alert in the Philippines, rather than the international organization helping them, they said, we want to become a national organization, an independent entity, go away. And they went through a fraught divorce process in order to do that. And they're now a thriving organization, Center for Climate and Conflict in Asia, based in Manila. So that's the only one I know about. Other people might have other examples. But I love this idea of mentorship and allyship, and that another RINGO prototype, the Decolonizing Advisory Community, I think that's at the heart of what it was trying to do, which is based at WACSI, and that's still being built, is to provide local people with centering their knowledge and skills to help the international organizations do what they should be doing. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we're nearly at time. So thank you everyone for joining. And that last point, Kevin, I think this whole issue around language, and when we started using Shift the Power as a hashtag in 2016, some people said this is a bad idea. We don't think development and philanthropy is a very polite sector. We talk about partnership, but we know full well that that is a very loaded term often. But for others to say, we can talk about power, let's talk about power. Power in all sorts of ways. This isn't just global north to global south, INGOs to local organization, but anyone with power, wherever they are, how it is named and articulated. So this issue of like, how do we deconstruct and reconstruct language so that it actually has meaning? We're not just going, it's just not performative. There was a beautiful moment at a meeting I was at, oh, my cat's just joined us, with last week with colleagues from the Philippines, from Indonesia, beg your pardon, who had started to work on an alternative way of measurement, and they call it pemaknan. It's a word from Bahasa Indonesia, and it literally means to make meaning. So rather than to come along with the regular tools of monitoring and evaluation, they have developed a program which really centers subjectivity, storytelling, and it's a whole methodology. And at some point, they started to use the English word sense-making. And as soon as they used the word sense-making, people started saying, oh, sense-making is this. And that kind of co-opting of meaning back, the sort of, the assertion of a sort of white supremacy, I'll tell you what sense-meaning means, meant they actually retreated to say, no, we will call it pemaknan, and you will find the meaning through our language, not the other way. And I think there's something so, language matters, and we are always, I was so familiar with using empty, redundant terms as a way of doing our business, our transactional stuff. So if there's, this book is, I really recommend it. It's a really easy, short read. Thank you, Deborah, because I was reading in the middle of the night in the midst of jet lag. but also a personal story which doesn't center Deborah, but rather your interactions with different parts of attempts to change. And I think it lays out the analysis of the problems, but also most importantly is where are the moments, the levers, where new configurations of allies and individuals from across the system, where none of us are going to change this on our own, actually can come together and start weaving new meaning, new configurations, new practices that build on what we've got, you know, the best of what we've got. So, Deborah, again, thank you so much. Despite your cold, you were brilliant. And thank you, everyone, also really for your active participation and reflection. And the work continues. So anyway, have a good rest of your day.